Hello and welcome to Hug in the Snug, where today I'm joined by Peter McManners, who is a strategic consultant and author. And we are going to be talking about flying, a bit of a hot topic for most people. Before we get into that, it's called Hug in the Snug for a reason, so we have to have a hug now. We need to break the ice. Okay, so you've written a book called Flying Be Damned. I, a while back, read something that had a bit of an impact on me. I read George Monbiot's Heat, and in there, at the end of his chapter on aviation, he says, every time you step on a plane, you destroy other people's lives. His conclusion was that he'd looked at the aviation industry, he couldn't see a feasible way of reducing emissions down to the 9% of what they are that they need to be, and therefore he said, we shouldn't be flying. And since then, I don't take short-haul flights. I try to avoid flying wherever possible. Am I doing the right thing? Am I going about it the right way? Is that the right attitude to take, or is there another option?
Well, you're certainly doing the right thing if you take that perspective to start with. What I've done, though, is looked at it, because lots of people won't agree with you. There's an awful lot of people say, no, I like flying. I like my cheap flights. A lot of people defend the economic benefit of flying, the social benefits that come from flying. And a little bit like George Monbiot, you can't change it. Sustainable Development Commission in its early years looked at aviation because it thought this is one of the most difficult nuts to crack, so we'll try and crack it. They found a highly polarised debate. There were people, as you described, environmentalists who say, I'm not going to fly, neither should you, and other people defending it, lots more defending it than opposing it. Very little common ground between the two. What I've looked at, researched at it, is if you take a view that I like flying, but that it must be low carbon, then there are ways forward.
Okay, so is there hope, or one day I'll be able to jet off all over the place on planes and not have to be riddled with guilt about my impact on the environment while I'm doing so?
Well, there's a number of things change. Your options are different, and so, for example, the speed at which you fly can change in a sustainable system, where if you're cost conscious, then you'll have to fly slower. So you won't be jetting off at fast speed, you'll be going at a slower speed.
And that's more fuel efficient?
There are some prototype air vehicles which are much more fuel efficient, but they have to travel slower. So that's one of the changes.
And how slow, if I was flying from here to Spain, and it normally takes, I don't know, 2 hours, is that a 2-hour flight, or 2.5 hours or something? How long would it take? Are we talking, is it going to take me 5 days to get to Spain on my super slow plane, or...?
Some of these new air vehicles, I use the word air vehicles because they don't necessarily look like aircraft, and the solution that engineers come up with may not be like some of the prototypes there are now, but generally if it takes the day, so you set off in the morning, you might be get above the clouds, you might be using solar power as well, so it's a morning flight that takes off, and it can take you all day. And if you think about going on holiday, these will be quite spacious, and so you'll be able to move around, quite a pleasant experience. And travelling usually takes you a day anyway, with all the bits at each end.
So sort of like taking the train, but doing it above the clouds.
Yes, and it's feasible, but it's not happening because there's a complete stalemate in policy, which locks down the system we have now, doesn't allow progress forward. And it's that stalemate, that's the stalemate we need to break.
So you're sort of saying there's a stalemate. There are, engineering and other sort of differences we could make to flying that would help make it a sustainable option, but there's a stalemate. Who's that stalemate between? What's stopping us progressing if there are possibilities out there?
Well, the thing is, the new aviation isn't commercially viable because aviation fuel is so cheap. Now, the airlines would counter that and say, hey, the price of oil is going up. But what's not known, really, in the general public is that there is no tax on aviation fuel. It's tax-free. So you fill up the car and 50% of that is taxed.
And
airlines are not paying
taxed
tax
at all on any of that?
No, and it's locked down that way because after the Second World War, there was a convention in Chicago which set the parameters for international aviation. And in that, it was agreed that no country could tax fuel on board an aircraft flying into the country. So if a country starts to tax aviation fuel, the airlines reconfigure not to take up fuel in that country. So say the UK said, hey, we should tax aviation fuel, and Parliament has looked at this. over a number of years has sometimes said we should do that. If the UK did it unilaterally, it would be a complete own goal, because long-haul flights would go elsewhere in Europe. We would become, we would be a short hop into Europe, but the long-haul flights would miss out Heathrow.
Because I was on the tube actually, I think yesterday or something, and I saw a poster which I think is obviously sponsored by Heathrow or some sort of lobbying group, and that's saying that if we want to get out of the economic crisis, then we have to not block aviation out. I can't remember exactly what it's saying, but we have to look at it, and that they are effectively, they were saying they are the answer to Britain's current economic crisis, and that by sort of supporting growth.
Third runway at Heathrow, more capacity.
Is that true? Is that something we're going to have to inevitably accept, or is there a kind of middle ground?
It's an argument that you've got to listen to, but you've got to look at where it really takes us. One of the barriers is that aircraft are designed to standard parameters, and airports are as well. And so the new Airbus, most efficient Airbus plane, couldn't have longer wings because they wouldn't have fitted, so it didn't have the most efficient design to fit with the airports. And so what we actually need to do, because the green air vehicles are going to be radically different, the airports are going to be different. So personally, I would argue that think about a new airport for London, which is, I know, there's a couple of options for that, but not in terms of conventional aircraft. Take that leap that says that new airport for London will be green air vehicles.
So a green airport where only green air vehicles can land, and that might sort of kickstart some people into
yes, and the engineers will have some great fun designing that and saying this is what it should look like.
And it really is, talking about the engineering, and you're talking about one of the options is flying slower. Are there really, prototype, whether they're actually built, but are there answers out there? I know that obviously if fuel's one of the biggest things, people have talked about biofuels, but that comes with all of its own issues. Is it really realistic, even thinking that those things could change, that we really could get to a point of an aircraft that is either fuel comparable to other efficient modes of transport, or could even be carbon zero or very low carbon?
You mentioned biofuel. Let me just mention briefly about biofuel, because there's big targets for international aviation of 80% of the fuel coming from biofuel. There's going to be huge demand for biofuel. The UK Committee on Climate Change looked at this and they said, well, perhaps 10% of aviation fuel can be from biofuel is a realistic target, because the demands for biofuel are going to be huge and the capacity is highly limited. So biofuel is a bit of a red herring. But the things that you could do and can do is, yes, you redesign the technology, and it can be done. And if I give you an example which I find quite interesting, which is in the book, is I looked at a study that the Americans did to replace their fleet of C-17 heavy lift jets. And the study concluded that these big hybrid air vehicles, if they built those instead, they're quite slow moving, they carry a lot of stuff. If they built those instead, compared with continuing with the C-17 heavy lift jet, and the study concluded, this was for defence, nothing to do with the environment, they didn't care about fuel consumption at all. It was totally viable, they would carry more freight for the same money, but the trouble is they wouldn't recommend it because these things would fly fairly slow and fairly low, and for a strategic asset, overflying into disputed countries or something like that, you want something that flies fast and high.
Yeah.
But it acknowledged the engineering is feasible. But you see, if defence is not going to pay for it, then traditionally an awful lot of aviation is paid for it by defence.
So if it's the new technologies get developed there, and then they sort of make their way into the commercial flights.
It's happened so many times. After the Second World War, the jet engine came in, and the search for speed for fighter aircraft. The speed is crucial, and you don't care how much fuel it uses. But it's interesting, the most recent aircraft have only just become more fuel efficient than the propeller-driven airliners of the 1950s that were replaced.
So we haven't made much progress.
Well, we've made huge progress between the early jetliners and now, but not between propeller aircraft and now. So, yeah, we've taken ourselves down a cul-de-sac of development, which we now have to back off from that and take us to where we need to go.
So there's quite radical changes needed rather than... And what will really drive that? I mean, you were saying one of the issues is you can't just look at the planes because airfields have to accommodate them. It sounds like, possibly the only answer is a very sort of coordinated global consensus, where if everyone and all the industries involved and all the governments involved said this has to happen, then maybe all those changes could happen. Is that the only way it will happen if everyone agrees, or are there companies or countries or groups that can lead the way in part of it, and will that have enough of an impact to, what's going to help us have this revolution in aviation?
You're right in both ways.
Okay.
People can lead on it, but in the end it has to be a world agreement, a global agreement, and that's what's made it so very, very difficult. The point is you can decide that at some point we say the impacts on the climate matter and we want to do something about it. Aviation is ruled by a convention that was delivered within 5 or 6 weeks of talking, whilst the Second World War was still running. All the world leaders have to do, and I recommend you do it at the G20 because it's a small enough group that people can make decisions, is to say we'll convene another convention on civil aviation, and in that convention we will look at that we should actually be taxing aviation fuel, and how can we do it. That's the only action they need to take, and that convention will then sit down. An awful lot of the current convention can stay, but it can't change itself because it's deeply ingrained as to how it is now. World leaders, at the moment you might say, well, they're not going to do that. But actually it's a fairly simple action for them. If someone says to them, climate change matters and you have to do something, what can you do? Sorting aviation is, from a political viewpoint, actually a very simple one, if they would agree to it.
So, I at the moment don't fly because, like I said at the beginning, it seems like a single flight and I've undone all of my energy saving efforts for the whole year. It seems to be such an enormous amount of emissions that there's not really a justified excuse, for me from an environmental point of view. Am I doing the right thing by doing that? Or even if I do stick with doing that, I like the idea that there's actually hope for the aviation industry, that if all the industries and governments do come together, this can change. What can I as an individual, or what can businesses look at doing? Where should we be putting the pressure? How can we sort of make this a reality?
If you choose not to fly, of course that's good in a sense, but the plane's flying anyway, there's seats available on the planes, it makes really very little difference. What you can do though is to buy into the idea that it could be different, which is what I explain when I write the book, understand that it can be different, and then decide to support that. And so you say to politicians, yes, I want to see a sustainable aviation sector. Because what's going to happen is, it's going to be quite difficult when they bring in policy. There's going to be a period of time when they're really going to have to change. The industry won't like doing this. The industry won't be volunteering because it's too difficult for the industry to volunteer to do this. It has to be government that lead on it. But if government does lead on it, in the short term, you may as well to get flying out of your system in the conventional planes once you've initiated the fact that we've got the changes coming through. So you support change, but no need to, particularly in my opinion, stop flying yourself, because that's not the main thing. Support change and persuade others to support it too.
So boycotting might not be really having a noticeable enough impact, but if we're lobbying or if we're showing our support when policies are suggested, that kind of government pressure is actually what's going to make the difference. Because really my boycotting is putting a pressure on the industry, and you're saying the industry, how it is or without help, isn't going to change. I mean, is that the case? Is the aviation industry just it's not capable of doing it alone?
It can't lead alone, and it's going to be hugely difficult when it does make the changes, and will need all the support it can get. So when government really take the nettle and change the policy, then aviation will find it difficult, but they can. There's all sorts of innovative little companies that can step in, and the big companies have expertise that they can apply if the policy is changed.
So with government driving it, all that potential is there. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we just have to hope that everyone in Westminster has read the book, is reading it now, or will read it, and that they see that this is something that they could tackle, and that would have
They should have confidence to tackle it, and when they do tackle it, we will see a wonderful further golden age of aviation that will set off because of it.
Brilliant. Well, I can't wait to be able to get back on a plane and not feel guilty about it. I look forward to my low carbon emissions flights. One last plug for the book. So it's called Fly and Be Damned. People can buy it in Amazon.
Amazon, any good bookshop, of course. Yes.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for writing it. Thank you for coming in and sharing it with us. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.